Wake up call.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
I'm going to start with Deputy Commissioner Brian Larkin. We had the pleasure, across party lines, of touring the RCMP lab here in Ottawa recently, hosted by yourself and others. And at that lab, your staff told me that they already extensively work with manufacturers to determine, they work with manufacturers when working on what firearms will come into Canada. Is that the case?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Lloyd, that is the case. We do work extensively with manufacturers, but the Canadian Firearms Program also does a fair bit of research independent of the manufacturers.
There seems to be an assertion that's being made that manufacturers are deliberately exploiting some nebulous loopholes in order to import and distribute firearms in Canada. Can manufacturers legally import and distribute firearms in Canada without the approval of the RCMP and classification?
Sorry, if you allow me, Mr. Chair, to support my colleague on this question. So the way it functions right now is, and I don't want to say it if it's a loophole or not, I'll just explain the process. If the gun that is manufactured in Canada is non-restricted, and deemed to be non-restricted by the manufacturer, they don't require to verify with the RCMP to verify the classification itself. So it is sold as non-restricted. What we heard from stakeholders is in some instances, these non-restricted, due to the complex classification, could be actually restricted, but it's sold in the market, and by the time the RCMP gets it, measure it, it's a very detailed process, as you probably saw when you had your visit.
Has this happened?
I don't have the numbers. I don't know. I'll refer to the RCMP. I just wanted to explain the process of the gap.
I actually don't have the numbers of how often this has happened, but I can say that since 2020, we have seen a significant increase of records or firearms in the industry that have not received an FRT number. And in doing that, can I back up a little bit to give a little bit of an explanation around verifiers?
Well, it seems to me, I do have limited time, but it seems to me that a manufacturer wouldn't want to be liable by importing a restricted firearm and saying it's a non-restricted firearm. Wouldn't the manufacturer be liable if they were importing firearms that were explicitly restricted or prohibited firearms, claiming that they're non-restricted?
So businesses and most of them are verifiers, and they do use the criminal code to identify the classification of firearms. Where the problem comes in is there's varying degrees of regulations that have now been put in place that the businesses may not be aware of. So when they deem a firearm to be non-restricted because of the barrel length, or they don't recognize that there's another OIC or there's a regulation.
Now this is all very interesting from a technical, but what we're here to determine is how can we make our streets safer? Is there any evidence that these firearms that maybe are somewhat vague in their classification that have come to Canada, are these being used in crimes? Do you have any evidence that these firearms have been, like that this is being exploited by criminals to bring these firearms into Canada for criminal use?
Those stats.
Okay. My next question, we've set this, the original amendment set that the muzzle velocity over 10,000 would be a new definition standard for an illegal firearm. That would be automatically banned by the definition. Now, this would include a very small amount of firearms, many of which are very expensive antique firearms used for hunting big game. In fact, the cost of ammunition for such a firearm is in the hundreds of dollars for a single box of ammunition. Do you have any evidence that these particular firearms that have been used for hunting purposes have been used to commit crimes in Canada that would justify their inclusion on this list?
Mr. Chair, through you, we don't have any evidence. We do not have that information.
Okay, so it's interesting. So it seems like it's not actually an objective decision based on evidence that this is a threat to public safety, that this is causing fatalities, or this is being used by crime. It seems like the decision to include this specific classification in the definition is purely based on subjective values on, we do not believe these firearms should be in Canada, but we don't have any objective evidence that they actually have posed a threat to Canadians. In terms of airsoft, it was also very interesting. I know I only have a little bit of time. It's not, most varieties of airsoft guns cannot really be converted into real firearms. Is that correct? Like the vast majority of airsoft guns, it would be very prohibitive for anyone to convert those into a real firearm. Is that correct?
There is a capacity, and especially when we talk about ghost guns, about using some components to use the airsoft, but also for the airsoft, just to be clear, what we heard from stakeholders is the concern as well from the police officers, because when they are identical.
Perhaps a ban on certain components rather than trying to ban an entire sport would be a better path forward to preventing this very, very rare occurrence from happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. I'd like to remind all members that our witnesses are here today in a non-partisan, non-political manner, and they can't give opinions about things beyond that. They can't. They're not here to defend government policy, but to explain it.
Mr. Larkin, first of all, Brian, thank you for your many years of service. Appreciate your leadership on the CPA. And Mr. Ranson, thank you for your military service. Greatly appreciated. So, for both of for all of the committee, did any one of you have a hand in the development of this Bill C21, or was that from the minister and his department specifically?
I'm part of the Department of Public Safety that provides the policy advice to the minister, for sure.
So that was something that you may have had a hand in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Now, again, if I demonstrate any ill will towards C21, it's not directed to you personally. All right, just so you know. Now, I know that we've had many people here talk about the impact of C21 or the lack of impact of C21. Now, did you provide the minister, or did anyone on this committee provide the minister or the Ministry of Public Safety with any, getting some feedback here, with any documentation or any evidence that the C21 as proposed was actually going to make a difference, positive difference on public safety in this country? Was there any evidence to support it?
I believe I've testified in this committee in the past, speaking about Bill C21 not only addressing crimes, but also addressing gender-based violence and as well mental health issues. And it is important to bear in mind, from my perspective as a policy wonk, if you wish, is that the bill is really a step among many other pillars that are important. And quite frankly, I do want to refer a little bit to the Mass Casualty Commission report that is asking us to look at what is community safety in Canada is, and not only in one pillar, but as a whole. And I do believe that Bill C21 is one of the steps, but not the full spectrum.
Well, I would disagree with that assessment, and I can. I don't see, and I've never seen anyone produce any credible evidence that suggests that going after law-abiding Canadian firearm owners will have any positive impact on public safety. We are all, everyone in this committee, all of the country, including the millions of firearm owners, are concerned and support the idea of improving public safety. This bill does not do that. And we've had witnesses at this committee who we thought would be very strong on aspects of the bill. They have said quite the opposite. They do not believe it'll have the positive impacts as planned. One of the things that I found interesting is when we had Dr. Bryant here, who is the Alberta's chief firearm officer, I asked her about the definition of a military-style assault weapon or military assault-style weapon, however terminology that is there. And I find it astounding that in fact, the word I used was ludicrous, and she agreed that there would be this definition or this term used with no definition. And now we're scrambling to try and find a definition for a term that really doesn't exist, and for no firearms that fits it, because the firearms that should fit this bill have already been prohibited in this country since the 70s. And so I asked Dr. Bryant the definition of what could be defined as a military-style assault weapon. And the answer was one that I knew, from my experience, to be a firearm capable of producing a rapid fire with one pull of the trigger with a large capacity magazine. All of those things are prohibited in this country already. So the fact that we're trying to find a definition for a term that already is a prohibited firearm, we're going to try and make it more prohibited. I find that actually quite astounding, to be honest with you. And we could be spending our time trying to tighten up and fix what maybe could be fixed or made stronger in the Firearms Act and other pieces of legislation. And so I find it interesting that's still what we're trying to do. The minister was here and said, we're going to basically ask this committee to come up with a definition of a prohibited, which is really a prohibited firearm. And, the only thing that I agree with the minister on is that there should be a separate body designed to classify firearms separate from the RCMP, not the RCMP not involved in it, but a non-political group of individuals with expertise, with the RCMP included, that define firearms and classify those firearms,
Mr. Motz,
period.
that's your time. I don't know if there's anything there you need to respond to or wish to, but if you wish to, please go ahead.
Just maybe say just a couple of words. And yes, I met as well personally with the chief firearm officer from Alberta, and she has very strong views. I'm not here to argue her views, but what is important is the intent of the definition was to provide clarity to what kind of guns we don't want in Canada. And this was the intention of having these characteristics defining, a little bit like you were saying, actually, what kind of characteristic of a gun that we will not be accepting in our country. And I think that was the purpose of this definition.
Thank you. Commissioner Larkin or Ms. Paquette, Statistics Canada seems to be getting better at providing some of the data that we need to make informed decisions. There was a recent report on violent crime involving firearms in 2021. And in that study, it was determined that a long gun, a rifle or a shotgun, not automatic, was involved or was present at 0.47% of all violent crimes. Out of that percentage, 0.47%, how many of those would be classified as an assault-style firearm?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we do not track that information, so we'd have to actually go back and do some homework, and we could attempt to respond to that, but we don't have that information available.
Presumably, it would be smaller than 0.47%, though. I presume there are 0.47% of those would involve regular shotguns, including even hunting shotguns and rifles that could be used in crimes, but so-called assault-style firearms would represent an even smaller fraction of that 0.47%. A situation's been brought to my attention, potential situation, when people are facing mental health challenges, we know they can recover, and gun owners are no different. When a legal firearm owner is going through a mental health challenge, sometimes they, under the previous rules, would transfer a firearm to another loved one or a friend who also had a firearms license. And then when they would get better, they would get that firearm back at a later date. Under the handgun freeze that has been implemented, it seems like there could be an unintended consequence in that people who are undergoing mental health challenges would not be able to transfer that firearm to a loved one.
10 seconds.
Would they be able to transfer it to law enforcement and get it back from law enforcement, or is that not even possible?
You want to speak to how, if somebody has a mental health case with the yellow flag, it could be, the PAL could be suspended for a while and brought back so the person could get it back. But it's not different than what right now is happening with red flag or yellow flag. If the police deems that the person should not be having their firearm, regardless if it's a handgun or not, they could revoke, well, the firearm the PAL could be revoked, and then once they're better, they could get it back. So, is that right? You could correct me if I'm wrong. Please go ahead.
Yes, you're correct. But also, if the individual is going through a crisis and they recognize that they would like temporary storage somewhere with a friend, or they can work through their chief firearms officer to do that.
Even with a handgun and transfer free.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd.
It wouldn't be permanent.